All right, folks, 18.9. Uh, 18.9 starts out with naming some other tissues that aren't typically thought of as endocrine tissues, but indeed do secrete hormones. So this gives you a list. The digestive system is a huge hormone source. In fact, secretin is the first hormone. Wow, sorry about that. Secretin is the first hormone discovered, and I believe it was discovered in a dog, but uh, definitely a big source of a lot of hormones. And the digestive system is the next system we do. So don't dismiss the endocrine system when you're done with it, because when we get into the digestive system, we're going to talk about hormones all over again and how we control and coordinate digestion and absorption. The kidneys, you probably already know, are a source of hormones. You've heard back in 203, we talked about how calcitriol synthesis begins in the skin when sunlight hits the skin and turns a steroid molecule into cholecalciferol. And of course, that cholecalciferol is hydroxylated in the liver and then hydroxylated again in the kidneys to make calcitriol. The other word for calcitriol, if this is vaguely familiar to you, is 1-alpha 25 dihydroxycholecalciferol. The first hydroxylation occurs in the liver. That's the 25 hydroxylation. I'm not going to be able to fit this chole. There we go, calciferol. And the second hydroxylation occurs in the kidney. And 1-alpha 25 dihydroxycholecalciferol is calcitriol, and that I know it's vitamin D, but it really is a hormone. It goes to the intestines and says, "Hey, absorb all this calcium that was consumed." EPO stands for erythropoietin. That's also secreted by the kidneys. And renin uh, is really not a hormone. It's really an enzyme. But what happens is, and this is a pathway you're going to learn again, and you learned it in 203 already, but you're going to learn it again now. It's an enzyme, but it's involved in activating the hormone angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. So we list it here as part of a hormonal pathway. The heart releases a couple hormones: atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. Now it says brain natriuretic peptide, but it's secreted by the ventricles. And of course, atrial natriuretic peptide is secreted by the atria. The thymus gland secretes a hormone called thymosin, and this is involved in the maturation and differentiation of T cells, T lymphocytes. The thymus gland atrophies into adulthood, but as a fetus and a baby, you have a large thymus and you secrete this hormone thymosin. Gonads, of course, you probably do think of as a source of hormones because you've heard of testosterone called an androgen, and of course you've heard of estrogens and progesterone. Adipose tissue you probably don't think of as an endocrine source. It is. Fat tissue secretes this hormone called leptin, and we'll talk more about it. In the skin, of course, you can come back up here, and the skin is linked to the kidneys in this calcitriol story. All right, so here's the calcitriol story. Sunlight hits the skin and changes a steroid molecule. Cholesterols are steroids. Let's just be clear here. A cholesterol is a steroid. Converts this cholesterol molecule into cholecalciferol. Now, that's pre-vitamin D. Cholecalciferol is hydroxylated in the liver to this intermediate form. That intermediate form's name is 25-hydroxycholecalciferol. Now, the 25-hydroxylase is the enzyme that does this hydroxylation. So 25-hydroxylase in the liver converts cholecalciferol into 25-hydroxycholecalciferol. That hits the kidneys, and there's a 1-alpha hydroxylase, which hydroxylates it again. And now I got 1-alpha 25 dihydroxycholecalciferol, and this is calcitriol. Now, why would I call it triol? 3 alcohols. Triol, 3 alcohols. And another name for an alcohol group is a hydroxy group. So why would I do that? And the answer is cholecalciferol already has one alcohol group. That's what the OL means. We add the second alcohol group when we do the 25 hydroxylation. We add the third alcohol group when we do the 1 alpha hydroxylation. It has 3 alcohol groups on it, so I call it calcitriol. This is active vitamin D. And active vitamin D goes to the intestines, and it says absorb calcium. All right. Kidneys as a endocrine source, as a hormone source. This is a pathway, this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, this RAS system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. You're going to have to know this again. So let's do that first. So first of all, we got falling blood pressure. We got low blood pressure. Low blood pressure. Ignore the oxygen for now. We'll come back and do that afterwards. With low blood pressure, we have renin secretion, renin release. Angiotensinogen is made in the liver, and that is a pro-hormone. So you're going to say to me, well, the liver's a source of hormones. You bet, it sure is. Angiotensinogen is a pro-hormone. Renin converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. This is a hormone that has weak vasoconstriction activity, but it's weak. It's a weak vasoconstrictor. So it doesn't raise blood pressure much. Okay? Remember, the falling blood pressure is what's initiated this. So the weak vasoconstrictor doesn't do too much, but it floats through the lungs, and in the lungs it encounters another enzyme called ACE. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay, that's what ACE stands for. And it runs into the lungs and it encounters ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, and angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a more potent vasoconstrictor. So it's going to cause vasoconstriction and raise your blood pressure more potently than angiotensin 1. In addition, angiotensin 2 does a couple other things. It goes to the adrenal cortex and tells it to secrete aldosterone. So it secretes aldosterone from the adrenal. It tells the adrenal cortex to make and secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone goes to the, let me erase this ACE stuff. Aldosterone goes to the kidneys and says, reabsorb more sodium. So this increases blood sodium. Water follows. Because what you have just done is you made the blood more hypertonic. Water always goes from a hypotonic environment into a hypertonic environment. If aldosterone caused more sodium reabsorption, so high sodium in blood, then water follows. This increases your volume. And one of the reasons your blood pressure could have been low was because of low volume. See, we started here with low blood pressure or low volume. So by increasing sodium retention or sodium reabsorption in the kidneys and water follows, we increase volume. Angiotensin 2 also goes up to the hypothalamus and says, I want some ADH secretion. Now, the hypothalamus doesn't store the ADH, the posterior pituitary does. The hypothalamus makes it, stores it in the posterior pituitary, but the hypothalamus has to tell the posterior pituitary to secrete it. So angiotensin 2 goes up to the hypothalamus and says, we want some ADH.
Sorry,
and ADH goes to the kidneys, and ADH goes to the kidneys and tells the kidneys to reabsorb more water. So that's antidiuretic hormone initiated by angiotensin 2, high water retention. Angiotensin 2 does another thing. Angiotensin 2 goes to your brain and makes you thirsty. So now you're drinking more water. So now you're drinking more water and you're retaining water because antidiuretic hormone goes to the kidneys and says retain water. And you're also reabsorbing more sodium, and that passively draws water with it. Okay. By the way, this aldosterone and ADH story we'll hit again when we do the urinary chapter, and we'll hit it hard. We'll be talking great details about it. All of this leads to increased fluid intake and retention, which raises my blood pressure and blood volume. That problem's now fixed. But what about this other problem? What about low oxygen tension or low oxygen? Well, we secrete a hormone called EPO, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin goes to the bone marrow and it causes erythropoiesis. What erythropoiesis is red blood cell production, erythrocyte production. So the hormone erythropoietin causes erythropoiesis. And when erythropoiesis, I get more red blood cells. This also adds to more blood volume. I'm adding cells to my blood. Of course, it's more volume. Each red blood cell is 90 femtoliters. So each red blood cell adds 90 femtoliters of volume to my blood. But it also increases my oxygen carrying capacity. So that fixes this low oxygen. All right, so that's the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and the erythropoietin system. And that comes from the kidneys. This is a collage showing you how skin and kidneys are involved in calcium homeostasis. And it's also showing you how the kidneys involved in blood pressure and oxygen tension homeostasis. All right, this picture is not in your book. But the adipose, well, the concept's in your book. The fact that adipose is a source of hormones. Adipose is a source of leptin. What happens is you eat and you start storing some fat in your adipose tissue, and leptin is secreted by adipose. Leptin is secreted by adipose, and that goes up to your brain and tells your brain that you're satiated or satisfied. All right? So leptin goes up to your brain and says you're satiated, you're satisfied, you stop eating. Now on that topic, the word orexigenic means hunger-inducing. The word anorexigenic means, the prefix a or an means without. Without hunger induction means you're satisfied or satiated or full, or however you want to say it. So orexigenic hormones make you hungry, and anorexigenic hormones say you're satiated. What are the orexigenic hormones? The orexigenic hormones are ghrelin, and they come from your stomach. Your stomach secretes ghrelin and goes up to your brain and says, I am hungry. And then you want to go eat. What are the anorexigenic hormones? Leptin is a big one. Peptide YY is a big one, and insulin's a big one. All three of these are anorexigenic hormones that say you're satiated or satisfied. By the way, peptide YY, the Y stands for tyrosine. It's just a one-letter abbreviation for an amino acid. See, there's three-letter abbreviations that you're probably used to, like tyrosine or alanine or glycine. But there's also one-letter abbreviations, and Y stands for tyrosine. So it's peptide, tyrosine. Tyrosine is what we're really saying. So these are anorexigenic hormones. Now, what's going on with these mice? Well, as it turns out, the big mouse doesn't have leptin receptors. It makes plenty of leptin, but it doesn't have the receptors, so it never feels satisfied or satiated, ever. So it keeps on eating and eating and eating, and of course it gains weight. Whereas this mouse is normal, it has leptin and leptin receptors, and when it eats a meal, it feels satisfied and then doesn't eat a meal for a while. So, and humans can have these conditions as well. Still on the leptin. This ties the autonomic nervous system together with this system, endocrine system. Remember in the autonomic nervous system, we talked about alpha and beta receptors, and I said beta 3 receptors are involved in lipolysis, breakdown of fats. Well, I'm about to tie back into that. Well, here's your adipose tissue, and it secretes leptin, right here, leptin. Leptin goes to your hypothalamus. It says, hey, you're satisfied. I'm satisfied. But what happens now after that occurs is the hypothalamus sends a signal back, a nervous signal back to the fat cell. Here's the sympathetic neuron going to the fat cell. And of course, sympathetic postganglionic neurons always secrete norepinephrine or epinephrine. In this case, it's norepinephrine. The receptors on the fat cell are beta 3 receptors. They're beta 3 adrenergic receptors, which leads to lipolysis. So you can see now that what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn, it's a G protein mediated event, turn on adenylyl cyclase, make cyclic AMP my second messenger, turn on some genes, and you start to break down these fats. In addition, here's what I do. I make this uncoupling protein. And what uncoupling protein does is that it tells the mitochondria that instead of making ATP, generate heat. So now I'm breaking down my fat, but I'm generating heat, not making ATP. Because what ATP would eventually do is shut down the beta oxidation. There would be a negative feedback where ATP controls this metabolism. But if I don't make the ATP, then I can burn this fat and keep on burning the fat and keep on burning the fat and just generate heat. Let me foreshadow chapter 25, because we're going to talk about this in 25. And plus, this was in your prerequisite, so let me remind you about something. What happens is glucose is broken down into pyruvate, 2 pyruvates actually, and this is called glycolysis. We carry some electrons. The electrons we carry, that we rip out of glucose, we carry as NADH. These are an electron carrier. Then pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, and that runs through the Krebs cycle. And we rip electrons out of the acetyl-CoA and we carry them as NADH and FADH too, but we'll just leave it as NADH right now. And then we run the electrons of NADH through this thing called the electron transport system, or sometimes the electron transport chain. Call it either thing. So the electrons from NADH run down through this electron transport chain. The oxygen ultimately accepts the electrons and is reduced to water. But where's my ATP? Well, what happens is when the electrons run down through this electron transport chain, I actually pump these protons across the membrane. So what happens is I get a whole bunch of protons, H+, on one side of the membrane. I got tons of them on one side of the inner mitochondrial membrane. Tons of them. Remember what protons are. Protons are hydrogen ions, hydrogen cations. They are also the definition of what it is to be acidic. So in essence, what I've done is I've made an acidic area in this mitochondria. Now, typically speaking, these protons flow back across the membrane through a protein called ATP synthase. And ADP is converted to ATP when these protons flow through ATP synthase. Now think about what happens in a test tube or in a beaker. When you add an acid to a base, you get water and salt, but that beaker heats up. All right. Well, the mitochondria doesn't allow all of this energy of adding the acid to the base escape as heat. We couple it to the phosphorylation of ADP to make ATP. That's what we do. Now that's if you have all of this ATP synthase. But what happens if I make an uncoupling protein that allows the protons to flow through, but they don't make ATP? Well, that's just adding an acid to a base, and I generate this heat right here. So this the sympathetic innervation of the fat cell to turn on a gene to make this uncoupling protein uncouples what we call oxidative phosphorylation. It uncouples this electron transport chain, and instead of the protons running through ATP synthase and generating ATP, they simply generate heat. And by the way, lots of organisms use this uncoupling protein. Another word for the uncoupling protein in mammals is thermogenin. Bears use thermogenin. They turn on the gene thermogenin when they're hibernating. And when they're hibernating in the middle of the winter, they generate heat. They burn their fat and generate heat, and they keep warm. Human babies have thermogenin turned on. And by the way, the kind of fat cells that really have thermogenin expressed at higher levels is called brown fat. So brown fat has thermogenin, and human babies and hibernating animals turn on thermogenin. Skunk cabbage, a plant, skunk cabbage turns on thermogenin, not the same mammalian thermogenin, but similar. It uncouples oxidative phosphorylation and generates heat. It does it for as an attractant to pollinators is really why it does it. But see, skunk cabbage attracts these pollinators in the wintertime. And when it generates the heat, it melts the snow around it. And you can see snow melted around skunk cabbage. Why? Because it's generating so much heat because it makes this uncoupling protein. All right, so that ties together the autonomic nervous system with the endocrine system through this adipose leptin sympathetic nervous system story. And it actually ties forward into the metabolism chapter, chapter 25. All right, this is a table of alternate endocrine glands. That's what this is. You can look at it. All right, hormones have different types of interactions. And we've already talked about all of these, really, but let me just list them for you. Hormones can have antagonistic effects. For example, insulin and glucagon. Insulin lowers blood glucose, glucagon raises blood glucose. For example, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium, calcitonin lowers blood calcium. So these are antagonistic effects. Hormones could have synergistic effects. Now you got to be careful because synergistic and integrative are similar. So let's be careful in the definition here. Synergistic effects are effects of two hormones that are additive. They enhance each other. Examples are growth hormone and cortisol. These are glucose sparing, fat burning effects. Glucose or growth hormone and cortisol spare glucose. All right, what that means is you do gluconeogenesis and you make glucose. You burn fats so you don't burn glucose. And both these hormones cause that. Whereas integrative effects, I'll skip permissive for now. Integrative effects is when hormones produce complementary results to each other. All right, so but they use a different mechanism. All right, so but they have complementary results. What are examples of that? Calcitriol and PTH. Calcitriol goes to the intestines and says to the intestines, absorb calcium that was consumed in the diet. This raises blood calcium. PTH goes to the bone and turns on osteoclasts. And osteoclasts digest bone, and this raises blood calcium. So they're raising blood calcium in different ways, but they complement each other by raising blood calcium. So synergistic and integrative, it might be sometimes hard to differentiate which one is going on here. Is it a synergistic effect or an integrative effect? Because they're really similar, and it's really splitting hairs to differentiate the two. The big difference is integrative effects. Hormones produce similar results through a different mechanism. All right, these are hormones that are important to growth. If you have a deficiency in growth hormone, you have pituitary dwarfism. If you have a deficiency, before I jump down there, I didn't even do the permissive effects. I just reminded me when I hit thyroid hormones. Permissive effects is when one hormone is necessary for another hormone to have a full effect. An example is epinephrine doesn't have a full effect unless thyroid hormone is there. Matter of fact, growth hormone doesn't have a full effect unless thyroid hormone is there. Thyroid hormone is the biggest permissive hormone there is. It's needed for many other hormones to have a full effect. And that's a permissive effect. Thyroid hormones are necessary for growth because of that permissive effect. And if you are hypothyroid at a critical time of your growth, like when you're a baby, you get this disease called cretinism. Cretinism. You get mental retardation and some other developmental problems. That's hypothyroidism. Insulin is necessary for growth. Not in the sense that you would think. I know what you're probably thinking right now. Right now you're thinking, oh, I need glucose in my cells to grow. Well, yeah, that's actually, probably it is what you think. That's true. Your cells need to burn glucose to have energy for the anabolic reactions. So really that is true. It is what you think. But insulin does more than just allow glucose into the cells. It also promotes protein synthesis and glycogen. Let me spell it. Glycogenesis. Glycogen synthesis. Glycogenesis. So insulin not only allows glucose to enter the cell, but it also promotes glucose, a whole bunch of glucose molecules forming into glycogenesis, and it promotes protein synthesis. So it's necessary for growth. Parathyroid hormone and calcitriol are necessary for growth because you need plenty of calcium for growth. You better be eucalcemic, and that means normal blood calcium. So calcium is available to the cells and tissues when they're going through growth. And you need testosterone and estrogen, your reproductive hormones, for growth. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 28. Okay, these are the hormones necessary for growth. And I already talked about pituitary dwarfism if you have too little growth hormone. I already talked about cretinism if you have hypothyroidism at a very young age, fetus to 1 year old, cretinism. We've already talked about diabetes. Of course, your bones can't grow unless there's plenty of blood calcium. So we need blood calcium for bones to grow. So the calcium can go into the bones, and you need normal blood calcium is caused by PTH going to the kidneys and turning on 1-alpha hydroxylase, which ultimately leads to calcitriol, and calcitriol tells the intestines to absorb all the calcium you ate. So there's that. And then there's reproductive hormones, testosterone and estrogens necessary for growth. All right, what about nutrient utilization? Well, nutrients move into cells right after you eat a meal. It says within 1 to 2 hours after a meal. No, actually what it says is nutrients move into cells, and within 1 to 2 hours after a meal, nutrient levels start to decline. When you eat, it's called the absorptive state. In a couple hours after you eat, it's called the post-absorptive state. I don't want to get too much into chapter 25, I believe it is, but because we'll get there. So what happens after you eat, 1 to 2 hours after you eat? Well, what happens is, after you ate, insulin went into your blood and caused the glucose to go into your cells. And then you start entering the post-absorptive state. Well, lower blood glucose levels lead to a decline in insulin. So now insulin declines. All right. If the insulin declines, glucose uptake decreases. And what do we burn? We burn lipids and proteins. So lipids and proteins start to be burnt by the cells. All right. Now the blood glucose is declining. So glucagon is secreted from the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. Glucagon tells me to break down glycogen. I break down glycogen and I release glucose. That's what glucagon does. That raises blood sugar. Lower blood nutrient levels leads to growth hormone secretion. What does growth hormone do? Growth hormone causes lipolysis. I release triglycerides into the circulation so my cells can burn lipids. That's what growth hormone does. Growth hormone comes over here, causes lipolysis, release of fatty acids into the circulation. And then later, cortisol secreted, and cortisol and growth hormone work together. Cortisol also leads to lipolysis and breakdown of fatty acids. All right, so that's nutrient utilization controlled by hormones. What about exercise? Well, in the short term, two hormones are really important for what happens to us in exercise, epinephrine and glucagon. I start to run and I use my ATP up in a few seconds. All right. I mean, I use my ATP up in like all the ATP in my muscles, in my leg muscles, are used in like 3 seconds. And then I might have another half a minute from creatine monophosphate, but I don't have a ton of time. So what I need to do now is start burning glucose and to make more ATP to keep my muscles contracting. Well, I burn glucose. Well, what happens? Epinephrine's secreted, and what epinephrine does is it causes glycogen breakdown and mobilization of glucose. What glucagon does is cause glycogen breakdown and the mobilization of glucose. So now I have tons of glucose to burn, and that's in the short term. What about in the long term? In the long term, ACTH from the pituitary goes to my adrenal cortex and says release cortisol. And cortisol causes liberation of fatty acids. It also turns on the enzymes that break down proteins. So in the long term, I switch over and start burning fats and proteins because of cortisol. But in the short term, I'm burning glucose because of epinephrine and glucagon. All right. So short term, two main hormones, epinephrine and glucagon. I mainly burn glucose, but I do have to switch over to fats in the long term. So what helps me switch over to fats is cortisol and growth hormone. Now here's the thing. So growth hormone and cortisol both cause lipolysis, and that is breakdown of fats. But they do something different from each other. Cortisol causes the breakdown of proteins. Growth hormone slows the breakdown of proteins. So they're both secreted, but cortisol is likely secreted first. So I initially, when my short-term exercise becomes long-term exercise, I initially break down fats and proteins. But that's only in the first couple hours. After the first couple hours, I then switch over to almost a pure fat burning stage because my growth hormone is secreted, and that slows down protein digestion. I shouldn't say digestion. Protein burning, protein breakdown. So I can serve my proteins at that point. All right. So that's hormone regulation during exercise. This is just a table of a whole bunch of hormones and the clinical implications of either high or low. Low is called hypo, underproduction, and high is called hyper, overproduction. You should read this table. You should be familiar with some of these diseases, and it should make sense. All right. All right, let's tell you how we know if you're hypo or hyper. First of all, whenever you're looking at a hypo or hyper condition, you look at the effector endocrine gland. You don't look at the hypothalamus that may have started the axis. You don't look at the pituitary that propagated the axis. You look at the effector gland. If there is something wrong with this effector gland, it's called a primary condition. So if there's something wrong with the thyroid gland, you either have primary hypothyroidism or primary hyperthyroidism. If there's something wrong with the thyroid and you have low T3 and T4, you have primary hypothyroidism. If there's something wrong with the thyroid gland and you have high T3 and T4, you have primary hyperthyroidism. But that's not the only way to be hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. You could also have something wrong with the hypothalamus or something wrong with the pituitary. The thyroid can be completely normal, but you're making too much or too little thyroid hormone because you're being told to by the pituitary or hypothalamus. For example, if you made a ton of TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. A lot of TRH tells the pituitary to make a lot of TSH. A lot of TSH tells the thyroid to make a lot of T3, T4. The thyroid's only doing what it's told. It's normal. But your hyperthyroidism, and this would be called secondary hyperthyroidism. Now, how do we know? Lab tests tell us. Let's just go through these. Let's do all 4 of them. Let's say you are primary hyperthyroidism. Okay, on primary hyper, something's wrong with my thyroid gland. I'm making a lot of T3, T4 for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons, but I'm making a lot of it. This T3 and T4 negatively feeds back and shuts down the pituitary. And by the way, likely shuts down the hypothalamus as well. It's just not shown. So now I shut down the pituitary and I shut down the hypothalamus. My TRH and TSH is very low. I measure the TSH in the lab. With primary hyperthyroidism, I have low TSH, but I have high T4. Now let's look at secondary hyperthyroidism. Now with secondary hyperthyroidism, my thyroid gland is completely normal, but there's something wrong either at my hypothalamus level or my pituitary level. All right. Now I still have high T4. That's the definition of hyperthyroidism. But my thyroid is doing what it's told. And there's something wrong with my pituitary gland or my hypothalamus. My T4 is trying to negatively feed back and shut down the pituitary, but the pituitary is ignoring it, and I have high TSH. And my thyroid is just doing what it's told. The high TSH causes the thyroid gland to make high T4. And the T4 is trying to negatively feed back and shut down the TSH, but my pituitary gland is ignoring it. So that's secondary hyper, and you can see the lab results are different. Primary is low TSH and high T4. Secondary is high TSH and high T4. I certainly have different lab results. All right. Let's do hypo. Primary hypothyroidism. Primary hypo. Well, first of all, I have low T4. That's the definition of hypo. What does my TSH look like? Well, remember, with primary hypo, I have low T3 and T4, and I almost said that wrong. And there's something wrong with the thyroid gland. The pituitary and hypothalamus is perfectly fine, but there's something wrong with the thyroid gland. I have hardly any T3 and T4. My negative feedback doesn't exist. How can there be negative feedback if there's hardly any T3 and T4? Therefore, my pituitary gland makes a ton of TSH. My hypothalamus makes a ton of TRH. I'm trying to turn on the thyroid gland, but my thyroid gland is lesioned, and I ignore it. It ignores the signals. So I have high TSH. All right, let's compare that with secondary hypothyroidism. Of course, I have low T4 because that's the definition of hypothyroidism. What's going on with my TSH? Well, let's erase all of this. Now remember, there's something, my thyroid gland is normal, but there's something wrong with my pituitary or hypothalamus. I have hardly any T3, T4. I don't have a negative feedback. I should be making a ton of TRH and TSH, but I'm not. They are ignoring the lack of negative feedback and not turning on production of TRH or TSH. And in fact, low TSH means the thyroid's doing what it's told. It's not making any T4. So this would be a low TSH. And this clinical picture is different. So can I tell the difference between primary hyper and secondary hyper and primary hypo and secondary hypo? Absolutely. And you can apply this to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, etc. We just did the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. All right, in this first picture right here, these are the same kids. This is before this kid had Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease is hypercortisolism, hyperadrenal cortisolism, if you will, and this is after. So this is high cortisol. Remember, it could be primary or secondary hyperadrenal cortisolism. I don't know which one it is. I'd have to look at the lab test. What cortisol does is it increases lipolysis and protein breakdown, and it also causes the deposition of some of these fats that you just liberated. It causes the deposition of some of these fats in odd places in the body. And you can see the Cushing's disease. This is called Cushing's disease, by the way. What's this right here? This is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. These are actually XY individuals. Um, they look like women. You're right, they look like women. But they are XY individuals that you make plenty of testosterone. You have normal testosterone, maybe even high testosterone, but you lack the receptors. So you ignore the testosterone. You don't have the receptors for it. Stands for, and what the name of the disease is androgen insensitivity syndrome. Why do they look like women? Because we all start out as females when we're fetuses. And then we either release this Mullerian inhibiting factor and turn into men, and have this SRY gene turned on and turn into men, or we continue with the feminine development and we make oviducts and ovaries, etc. Well, if I have androgen insensitivity syndrome, what happens is I ignore my testosterone because I lack the receptors, and I continue along the female pathway of development.